Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahid Jurgen. We're continuing our study of 1 Corinthians 7, and this is part 2 of the theme that we established last time, Remain as You Are. We'll be looking at 1 Corinthians 7 verses 17 through 40, and this is lesson 11 in our series through the book of 1 Corinthians. Now, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 begins to respond to some Corinthian questions, things about which they had written in their own letter to him. And in his response to the particular issue that's raised in this chapter, Paul basically establishes a theme that dominates the whole chapter: remain as you are. Paul wants the Corinthians to know that they can serve God faithfully no matter their circumstances in life. In fact, Paul commands this twice. In verse 20, he says, each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. And repeats that in verse 24. Brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. And really, he said almost the exact same thing in verse 17 when he laid out this important principle. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. So we learn from these passages that people from many different social and relational backgrounds become Christians. But no matter what your status is in life, you can be loyal to Christ right where you are. The chapter is outlined as follows. Paul first addresses married people and tells them to enjoy marriage with all of its rights and benefits. He talks about unmarried people and widows and tells them it's good for them to remain single. He comes back to married Christians and encourages them, in fact, commands them to remain married. Even those Christians with an unbelieving spouse are told to remain married. That was what we covered in our last lesson. Today, we'll talk about those who are circumcised or uncircumcised, and spoiler alert, Paul tells them to remain either circumcised or uncircumcised. To the slave, he says, remain a slave unless you can be made free. To virgins, he tells them that it's good to remain single. And to the married, and then to widows, he says that married people are bound to marriage, and when someone becomes widowed, it's good for that person to remain single. So that's the general outline. We'll begin reading now in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 17 through 20. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Now, in the first century, one method of categorizing people was to identify them as either Jew or Gentile. Gentile just basically means everyone who was not Jewish. And these classifications were multifaceted, but mostly they were concerned with the religious distinction between those who worship the living God of Israel as opposed to the pantheon of idols honored in pagan cultures. Jews and Gentiles came crashing together into the body of Christ. For Jesus has reconciled both to God in one body through the cross, according to Ephesians 2 and verse 16. Corinth was one of those places where Jews and Gentiles came together in the Lord. And so Paul addressed this question. Were you an Israelite? Were you circumcised? Or were you a Gentile, uncircumcised, when you were called? Students of the New Testament know that the issue of circumcision generated a significant controversy in the first century. Paul was often at odds with the Judaizing teachers who insisted that Gentile converts to Christ must be circumcised and follow other Jewish practices in order to be right with God. And this controversy, for example, was center stage in Acts 15, when the apostles and other leading Christians gathered in Jerusalem to make make it clear that the markers of Judaism were not necessary for salvation. As Paul had written, we know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Galatians 2 and verse 16. That was Paul's conviction, and that's the conviction he reaffirms right here in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 19 when he says, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Circumcision was a sign of the covenant God made with Abraham, according to Genesis 17. And that practice was carried over into the Mosaic covenant for the Jewish people to keep, according to passages like Leviticus 12, 1 through 3. In Christ, circumcision is meaningless. It has no bearing on a person's standing with God. It's no longer how God's people are identified. So Gentiles should not feel in any way compelled to be circumcised. But Paul adds kind of an interesting twist on this when he applies the same principle to Jewish Christians. They did not have to become uncircumcised. Now, how did that work? Well, some scholars speculate that in order to rise higher in Gentile society, some Jewish men actually had a surgery performed on them to make them appear uncircumcised. But Paul could just simply mean this in the sense of living like a member of the Gentile community. I think that's probably the meaning here. But either way, the theme is well established. Remain as you are. You don't need to change in this regard in order to serve Christ. All right? Now, circumcised and uncircumcised. Let's look at the next scenario, verses 21 through 24. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Now, you'll notice that Paul's instructions to the slaves has a bit of a different nuance than some of his other teachings in this chapter. He told the circumcised and uncircumcised not to change, whereas to the slave, he tells them, don't let it trouble you. Now, Paul gave special instructions to Christian slaves and Christian masters in some of his other letters, like in Ephesians 6 and Colossians 3. He commanded servants to be obedient and to work diligently for their masters as if they were working for the Lord. Paul never encouraged rebellion, because I think he knew, as is the message here in 1 Corinthians 7, that a Christian can serve the Lord in any condition and in any setting. However, Paul made one exception to the normal rule of remaining as you are, and I think he made that exception for the sake of the gospel. He says Christian slaves should not fret about their condition, but if they have an opportunity to become free, that's great, and they should seize it and use their freedom to serve Christ more fully. The letter to Philemon is a perfect illustration of Paul's message here. Philemon had a slave named Onesimus. Onesimus fled and eventually found Paul in Rome. Onesimus became a Christian, and Paul said to Philemon in verse 13 of that little letter, I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. So Paul identifies here an advantage for the sake of the gospel if Onesimus was free, because that would allow him to continue to minister alongside Paul in Rome. But even still, to the slave, Paul wrote, each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. All right, that's scenario number 2 for this section. Now let's look at the next scenario, verses 25 through 31. Verses 25 through 31. Now about virgins. I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you of this. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. It seems that the Corinthians had asked Paul whether or not virgins should go ahead and get married. He says, well, I don't have a command from the Lord, I think, which means Jesus never addressed this issue. Instead, Paul sets himself forth as a trustworthy judge on such matters, and thus dispenses some truth for the Corinthians to heed. And before directly answering the question about virgins getting married, Paul highlighted some reasons for single Christians to remain single. The first reason is something he calls the present crisis, or the impending distress that's facing the Corinthians, verse 26. The exact nature of this crisis is uncertain. It could have been a famine under Claudius, general persecutions and economic hardships, the growing tension between Rome and the Judean Jews, which led to the destruction of Jerusalem, or something else altogether. Whatever it was, it led Paul to the conclusion that it would be best for single Christians to remain unmarried because life would be easier that way. A second reason to stay single is stated in verse 28, and it's the fact that many troubles will face married people. Married people will experience many troubles. Now, these troubles could be connected to verse 26, the present crisis, or it could be connected to the next paragraph, which will outline yet another reason to remain single. We'll get to that in just a second. But the point is this: Paul was prefacing his remarks about virgins remaining single with this stipulated reality that the Corinthian Christians were facing grave personal challenges. And the apostle believed these challenges would be compounded by marriage. In addition to their present challenges, Paul wanted to ensure that the Corinthians had the proper perspective about what really matters in life. And that's what he addresses in verses 29 through 31. This has really been one of the reoccurring themes of the whole letter. The Corinthians, like many modern Christians, were consumed with the matters of life that were ultimately trivial compared to the radically changed cosmic paradigm which results from the work of Jesus. Paul says, listen, you need to remember, life is not about marriage, mourning, rejoicing, purchasing, or even dealing with the world. It's about how Christ is remaking the world into his new creation. So don't get bogged down by these other things and let them deter you from what really matters most, your service to the Lord. And that theme is going to continue to be focused on here in verses 32 through 35. I would like you to be free from concern, he says. An unmarried man, a single man, is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. No matter their social status, Paul did not want the Corinthians to become preoccupied by earthly cares which would distract them from their service to God. So he gave them yet another reason to remain single, and that is that spouses are a distraction. So we have some kind of present crisis in the previous paragraph, and now spouses are a distraction. Those who are married have a responsibility to care for their spouse. Those who are single have no such concern, and they can focus more time and attention on serving Christ and his kingdom with unhindered devotion to the Lord. As Blomberg notes, verse 35 supplies the most crucial clue in the whole chapter for determining when marriage is or is not appropriate. Whichever state enables one to live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord is preferable. Paul doesn't wish to restrict his audience, literally throw a noose around them one way or the other. So that is a dominant theme that Paul continues to emphasize over and over again. The setting, the situation, which is preferable, is whichever situation or setting allows maximum unhindered devotion to Christ. Okay, we've got yet another scenario related to the one we've just discussed in verses 36 through 38. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. Now, I want to tell you that translators have long struggled with this passage. And because the translation is difficult, the interpretation is even more difficult. And what's particularly hard is knowing what scenario Paul is describing. The question that we discussed earlier, back up in verse 25, concerns whether or not virgins should get married. So if you're unmarried, if you're single, should you get married? The confusion here stems from knowing who the person of interest is in verse 36. Some translations, like the New Revised Standard Version, identifies the subject as the fiancé of the virgins who were discussed in the previous section. So, the virgins are addressed first, and then those to whom those virgins are betrothed. But others, like the New American Standard, make rather than the fiancé, the person of interest here, the virgin's father as the one who is being addressed. So let's read the NASB just to understand how that would look, verses 36 through 38. But if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly towards his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let her marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, but has authority over his own will, and has decided this in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. So then, both he who gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. So the NASB understands the Corinthian concern this way. Should a father who has likely arranged a marriage for his daughter go forward with that arrangement, or should he break the commitment and let his daughter remain unmarried? The answer from Paul, if he feels compelled to let her go through with the marriage, fine. If not, that's better, because she can remain unmarried and serve God without distraction. But the principle that's been well established throughout the chapter stands. He wants everyone to just remain as they are. The other option is very similar. Should a man who is betrothed to a woman go through with that marriage? Paul allows for either option while noting he who marries his fiancée does well, he who refrains from marriage will do better, for all of those reasons stated earlier. It might seem like Paul's really getting into some nitty-gritty hypothetical situation discussion here, and in a sense he is, but remember, these were the exact scenarios the Corinthians were facing, and these were the scenarios they needed help navigating. They wrote Paul, they said, we've got different people here in all these different situations, what should they do? And the theme for all of them has been and continues to be, remain where they are, whatever situation is best for the sake of the gospel and allows for service to God with unhindered devotion is ideal. And there's one more scenario that Paul's going to address as now he rounds out this discussion, and it's found here in verses 39 and 40. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Paul concludes this discussion with a possible concern, I think, that married women might be tempted to leave their husbands after hearing what good work single women can do for Christ. They may read Paul's words about unhindered devotion, free from the responsibility of their husbands that can occur for single women. And they think, well, I'm just going to leave this man and I'm going to go off and serve Christ. Paul says, whoa, whoa, whoa. I want to remind you that wives are bound to their husbands for life. Paul expressed a very similar sentiment in the book of Romans. In chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, he said, do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I'm speaking to those who know the law, that the law has authority over someone only as long as that person lives? For example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive, but if her husband dies, she's released from the law that binds her to him. So then, if she has sexual relations with another man while her husband is still alive, she is called adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's released from that law and is not an adulteress if she marries another man. So we have another hypothetical here. What happens if the husband of a Christian woman dies, and now she becomes a widow? Well, Paul says she's got a couple of options. Of course, she can remarry if she chooses, or she can remain single. The widow is free to marry if she so desires. However, Paul adds an important caveat that she is to marry only in the Lord. As a more modern translation renders verse 39, a wife should stay married to her husband until he dies. Then she is free to marry again, but only to a man who is a follower of the Lord. Schreiner offers this explanation of Paul's remark here. Remarriage at death is permitted, and the choice of a marriage partner is left up to the desires of the woman. She's not to be forced to marry someone against her will. Still, Paul adds a final qualification. She is to marry only in the Lord, which the NIV rightly translates as, he must belong to the Lord. The wife may marry anyone she prefers to marry, but the man must be a believer. She's not free to marry a man who is an unbeliever. Apparently, a woman who belongs to and loves Christ expresses her Christian faith by marrying a person of the opposite sex who also belongs to Jesus Christ. I want to remind us of something we discussed in our last lesson, particularly about verses 12 through 16, where Paul describes a scenario of some Christians who were married to unbelievers. And we talked about how the context of this whole chapter is how people are when they become Christians. And so we have these mixed marriage scenarios, a Christian and an unbeliever, that seem to be the result of one spouse becoming a follower of Jesus and the other remaining an unbeliever. Now, what are they supposed to do? In that discussion, verses 12 through 16, I noted that this text does not offer any insight into whether or not Christians should marry unbelievers. Paul was addressing how people were when they were called, not what they should do once they are called. That was the scenario. And while those verses, 1 Corinthians 7:12 through 16, I think offer no insight or opinion about whether or not Christians should go out and marry unbelievers, I think verse 39 does offer some insight on this question. When giving instructions to Christian women, Paul told them that if their husbands die and they want to get married again, they can only marry Christian men. It seems to me the inescapable conclusion is that believers who are looking to get married should marry in the Lord. Now, the present distress is occurring, and so Paul wants the second option to be preferred for widows, to remain single and serve the Lord without distraction, which is why he believes she'll be happier if she stays as he is. Closing with those words, I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Now, I want to say about this whole chapter, no matter what scenario you might find yourselves associating with, which of these possible situations seems to fit your life best, one thing that all of us should be happy about, and one thing we should praise God about, is the fact that we know from this chapter that no matter where we are in life, no matter what our social setting and circumstance might be, we can serve Christ right where we are, wherever we are. What's your relationship status? Are you single? Are you dating? Are you engaged or married? Are you widowed? It's good to be single. It's good to be married. It's good even to be widowed. Now, some states might be better than others, depending on a variety of factors, but no matter what, you can be a Christian in all of these relational settings. The important thing to remember is that if you're going to change your relationship status, your chief objective is to be moving in a direction that makes it easier for you to serve God and never harder. That's the rule. Remain as you are, and if you're going to change, do so with that objective in mind. To make your Christian life, your work, your devotion to Christ easier and never harder. What about your social status? For the ancients, it was circumcised or uncircumcised. Today, we have all kinds of social circles, all kinds of customs and peculiarities that one might find themselves in. You can be a Christian in all of those settings, wherever you are. What about your financial status? Are you low or high on the ladder of economic success? Paul's audience was a mixture of lowly slaves and wealthy masters. And he told them, especially those who were poor, don't fret. Everyone can be a Christian no matter how much money they make. Paul wants us to know that we can just remain as we are, and we can serve God as we are. This is Paul's message to the Corinthians. It's his message, as he says in verse 17, to all the churches, and certainly it's his message to us, for we know he had the Spirit of God. Paul guides us through as we try to navigate all of the difficulties of life, how we can best serve the Lord. Remain as you are. Find ways in your own life as it is now to serve God to the very best of your ability. God bless you, and I hope to see you as we continue our study into 1 Corinthians 8 next time.